Hello, everybody. So welcome to the next session. My name is Peter Stoyko, and I come from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Although I just recently re-entered government, I've been working in a number of different kind of sectors, public sector, private sector, nonprofit. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about a guide that we've developed at FAC about how to do data service teams. Some of the people might be familiar with service design. This is kind of this large area that's devoted to the subject about how do we make services better for clients, whether that's something like Starbucks or these types of services. And also how to do data science better. It's the combination of these two worlds, which is kind of an interesting fit, that didn't seem to have a lot of guidance to it. We've got guides for service design, we've got guides for data science. Bringing those two together was really important because increasingly, services are becoming more and more about data. They're more using advanced technologies, your smartphone, these sorts of things. And so we wanted to kind of find a way to socialize some of these concepts to a larger workforce. And so we've got a longer version and a shorter version because, you know, office folks sometimes don't have enough time to kind of go into in-depth reading. But we also wanted to make sure that we had something that was a good reference too. So what I want to do today is I just want to step you through three of the frameworks that they're kind of linchpins within this guide, to give you a little bit of an enticement to kind of take a closer look at the guide itself. So first, let's talk a little bit about what I'm talking about when I say data service. So a data service can be a variety of things. It can be things like the Maps application on your phone. It can be things like how to verify that you've been inoculated, or these sorts of things. But it's also drawing data in for analysts or using data as a reference or things like that. Or even just providing researchers with access to a database. There's a lot of different ways in which we can think about what a data service is. And one of the big problems, that at least what we're having at FAC, is a lot of the data that we deal with is really kind of stale. Like, if it isn't arriving fast enough that we can actually do something about it, if it's not actionable, like if we're receiving information about an impending disease but only 2 years late, which is what some surveillance systems actually do, then it's no good to anybody. Sometimes the data doesn't come in a form that's very useful for the people and fits into their workflow. Sometimes just the data is a frustrating experience, and if you've done any work, played with banking machines or any sorts of technology, you've known the frustrations of that. But also there's a growing worry about the trustworthiness of data and privacy and these sorts of problems. So what's a data service team? So one of the challenges that we have is, for those of us who work in developer world, sometimes they build services thinking of this kind of heroic user who's basically themselves, but who understands the whole design space really well. When in fact there's a diversity of clients, some of which don't know anything about your service, and you've got to kind of draw them in. So what we've designed from our experience, and this comes from a lot of the work that I've done here in Toronto at the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service. We talk about this client-centered 4-step. So this is a kind of thing that we ought to be thinking about every time we do any sort of service or design any kind of system, which is, who are the direct clients that we're serving? And then what is their world? So what is their usage scenario? What are the roles that they're playing? These sorts of things. Because you want to understand how this relates to them in situ, in context. But because a lot of the stuff that we do in government, especially in the federal government, is kind of internal services, we have to think about who the clients' clients are. So for example, we might be giving data to a bunch of analysts. Those analysts then have to hand off advice to a bunch of executives. And if we're not designing services to cater to that situation, then we're not really being very helpful, right? And then we also have to think about what the end game is. So what is it in the bigger picture? Because we can try to be very client-centered, but sometimes we can miss the boat in terms of achieving a worthwhile public service goal, right? So what we also try to do is we try to encourage people to think very expansively about who that downstream user could be. So it's not just like the person and the person's boss, but we cause people to kind of actively think about how can we put the data directly in the hands of people, for example, like the general public, as opposed to just, or frontline servers, as opposed to those who are closest to the data source, or the policy wonks who just happen to get more access to our developers. So everything that I've been doing, at least since the late 90s, has been some form of dialogue-based participatory design, which involves bringing the clients into the design circle, bringing the stakeholders into the design circle, so they can be active co-creators in the services that we create. And so we have an involvement model. So here, when it comes to FAC in particular, we have to think carefully about who the data owners are, because quite often that's the provinces, or that's or it could be like a non-governmental organization. But quite often they rely on others further upstream for their data as well. So we have to think a little bit more about how do we invite those people in, because these are the people who have the knowledge of the data itself. But also we're thinking about clients, downstream clients, but also subject experts, development experts, and platform builders. And we're bringing them into the design circle, right? So how does this process work? So first of all, we often get a request from someone saying, we want to design a service, and give us a dashboard. Everyone wants a dashboard, right? And so the first thing we say is, well, that's great, but let's not rush to solutions. Let's explore the design space. So there's this idea called divergent and convergent thinking, right? It comes from the psychology literature. When we're divergent thinking, we're thinking of possibilities. We're thinking broadly and trying to expand the horizons of what's possible. When we're doing convergent thinking, what we're doing is we're narrowing things down, we're scrutinizing things, we're coming to decisions. And so the UK Design Council created this idea of a double diamond process. And so this is the second framework I like to kind of speak to, which speaks to two rounds of this kind of divergent and convergent thinking. And this is the 20th anniversary of this framework, and the UK Design Council has kind of featured our version of this double diamond in their promotional materials recently for the 20th anniversary. So the whole process kind of works like this, which is there's some sort of project intake, and instead of like nailing down specifications or nailing down the project in a very detailed sort of way, we say, give us the basic sandbox. Like, what are the basic parameters? Don't overcook it first. Give us some room to explore. Then we kind of start to look at the design space in a more discovery-oriented, exploratory way, and then we bring it down, and then it's only then that we have a really strong sense of what the problem is and what we want to build. And then we start designing and we start looking at options of how to fulfill this problem. And then we develop focusing on the product that we've settled on up until launch. So let me just kind of give you a speed run about what this looks like as it actually unfolds. Like, pretend you're on the mezzanine view, just like here in the hotel, in the mezzanine over here, looking down into the lobby. If people were doing this, what would it look like? It would look like this. So first of all, we have this onboarding thing, and we talk a lot about what we call a warm handoff. This is a term that doctors use to say, we found these people who have a problem, and we've kind of explored it with them. We think it's right for a new data service, and we're bringing you to people who can actually build this service. And we're not just kind of foisting them on you, we're kind of doing the warm handoff where we're exploring the challenge in itself. Then we start to assemble a team, and it's sort of, we think about this in terms of minimal viable organization, which is sort of like we start small, and as we need more people, as the development grows, we bring more people in, we try to rope more people in. All the while trying to avoid using the no tourist rule, right? Which is like, if you're not contributing, then you really can't just kind of take pot shots from the sidelines. And so we try to keep it lean. Then it's sort of like the issue of not everybody is familiar with design thinking and system thinking and some of these concepts. It's a very different way of doing things from a kind of like I have a management degree, and it's a very different way of approaching things than the usual management methods. It involves a lot of craft knowledge, it involves a lot of exploratory work, and so we have a bit of an orientation to kind of introduce people to this. Then we say, give us all your information. Like, let's take stock of what we've got already. The rule here is that we want to first do no harm. We don't want to kind of wreck the good work that's happened before, and we want to have a sense of what the history of this organization, of this service is, before we start doing things. Because quite often the people who are coming to the table are new to their jobs, and they don't really know the history of their organization. We then start to think about who are the clients? What are the types of clients that you're dealing with here? Quite often it's left at the level of assumption that people understand who their clients are, but in truth, they don't even know half of it, right? So we start to systematically map the client base, and then we invite them in, because we want to invite them in early so that they have, while things are very unsettled, we get their input into the process and treat them as genuine co-creators. Then we ask them, tell us your world. Give us the usage scenario so that we understand things from your point of view, so that we can kind of map that out. And also we explore the end game. We explore like, what are the big picture considerations that we're trying to move towards in terms of larger policy goals? Because we can't lose sight of those as well. Those are kind of a North Star. After that, we do some field work. We don't stick in the office. We go and we do research. That's the ideal, at least. We want to go out to where the people are, find out what their problems are, where they are, because it's only there that you're going to find all the little kind of important details about how the service ought to be designed. We kind of profile the clients because there might be some certain types of clients that we might want to design to that might be very useful. And we want to make sure that no one loses sight of these personas, as we call them, right? We want to make sure that there are people at the later stages of design are still using these, thinking in their minds about who the real clients are, as opposed to just thinking of it as themselves. We do some client journey work, so we map out how they go through the system as it exists and how they could go through a system in the future. We're looking for pain points. What are the things that frustrate people? And then we start to reframe the issues, like how can this be thought of differently? How can we just kind of change maybe the points of reference or some of the metaphors that are used to kind of describe this service in order to kind of coax some ideas and some thinking. And we think about in terms of foresight. So we don't think about just the immediate problems. We think about what's this like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line. How is the technology going to change? How is the service going to have to evolve? These sorts of things, because we want to make sure, we can't make things future-proof, that's kind of a myth, but we want to be able to make things so that they're flexible and they anticipate problems in the future. And it's with all of this we start to synthesize the ideas. We start to put things aside, we start to see where certain problems are kind of clustering, and we come to a problem definition. And so we start brainstorming. We start coming up with ideas like, how could we possibly cope with this problem or challenge? And then we look at constraints. So we take constraints seriously. We take trade-offs seriously, because all design involves dealing with these sorts of trade-offs and constraints and working within them. We do human factors analysis. So we look at how humans are fallible. Humans have different abilities. We all are at one point or another in our lives going to be handicapped as we age. We have special needs. We want to make sure that we're designing the service so that everybody is catered to. And we think about the service channels, and we think about that creatively, because everyone maybe wants to create a dashboard, or create a web app, but what if we create an alert for, say, provincial counterparts? Or what if we create, we make use of the new computer watches and things like that? We can think about some of these alternative methods. We build mock-ups to kind of give form and visualize some of the options, and we develop prototypes. We kind of race to coming up with something clickable. And once we get something clickable, we can actually start putting users in front of it. We can start testing it right away, and we want to do this early and often. And we also want to not lose sight of some of the architectural pieces, because we want to make sure some of this stuff is viable in terms of a larger systems perspective, and I'll get to that a little bit later. And we deal with the openness and security issues as well. We probably try to bring security people in early, but there has to be some sort of process with which we kind of dwell on that. And we're always thinking about how do we reuse our components for others, and how do we use others' components so we're not reinventing the wheel. We do an alpha build, so this is kind of getting viable, just enough that we can do some field testing. Again, it's more user testing, but it's in context. And then we have a beta build, so we're getting something that we can actually introduce now to a bigger audience. And the data service team then kind of sheds a lot of its members, leaves some developers behind because there's still a lot of bug squashing and things like that to do. And then we have a launch. But of course, a launch is only an opportunity to kind of draw new feedback from people. So, and the goal here is to do continuous improvement, because it's not just one and done. We're always going to be evolving things. And so that's the second framework I wanted to talk about. And now I wanted to talk about a third framework that, for people who have, like, I spent a lot of time doing service design, and sometimes I'd throw things over the fence to developers and just like, you can deal with that, you figure it out. And I found that it doesn't work very well. So with age comes a bit of wisdom, and so we're thinking about how do we create a lean production process and think a little bit more about how do we think about the infrastructure itself. So we think of this in terms of 3 axes. The first is every data pipeline, it can be thought of as a supply chain, and we can think of it end to end. The second is like a technology stack. There are different foundational technologies up through to the user interface. How do we think about that? So that's the other axis. And then we can think of it in terms of an ecosystem, which is across operations, how can we perpetuate some good practices? How can we share some of these systems in order to be able to kind of ramp up some services very quickly? So let's talk about some of these in a little bit more detail. So first of all, if we think about end-to-end supply chain, we're thinking about how is the data collected on the one hand, and then there's a bunch of raw processing tasks and a storage, right? So we've got some sort of data access point, API gateway, that sort of thing, ideally. And then from there, it's just sort of like, what's the downstream flow? Like, how do people access the refined data, and how are they making use of that? And in fact, this is the kind of, like, we have a crazy variety of data that we're dealing with. We're dealing with physical samples, sensor data. We're dealing with like feeds, and we're dealing with forms, and we're dealing with records, and a lot of it is in paper, and a lot of it is just like CSV files, like spreadsheet tables, right? So how do we feed that in ways that can kind of be useful? And so there's a process we do this securely with extract, transform, load processes. But there's just a bunch of good things very early in the pipeline that most service designers never think about. But I'm just kind of encouraging people to do so, which is like, how do we get people to digitize their data that isn't in a usable form? How do we do better code cleaning? Reduce the manual reentry steps. I've dealt with some cases where people have reentered data at 3 different stages in a pipeline, and it's just sort of like, what are you doing? No wonder it takes 2 years to get something done. Process automation and these sorts of things in order to kind of look at the front end of the data system, so that downstream you're going to get much better and data and much more real-time and useful data. And what this involves is that for every data user or data owner, they have to think a little bit, and this is something that Chris probably mentioned, Chris Allison, who I work with, who mentioned at the first session. We think about this in terms of turning data into a product. What this involves is every data owner controls their own data. We don't get in their face about this sort of thing. We want some interoperability, of course. We want it to be self-describing. We want to have a certain kind of things involved, but we don't tell them what to do. But in exchange, the obligation is on them to kind of think a little bit about how to make data useful for people downstream. And so this is the model that we use. So always in the cloud database, self-describing data with metadata, self-serve data streams with APIs, that sort of thing, right? Fair principles, of course. And so we think of this in terms of the federated data, and I'm not going to go through this in detail because Chris did so earlier in the day, but it involves being able to access more than one database at a time by just kind of feeding things through an API gateway and so forth. And so what does this kind of open up? So I'll just kind of point a few scenarios here. So like, for example, if we've got analysts who are doing, trying to track data, for example, suddenly they can tap into real-time data that isn't the CSV file that gets stale as soon as it's kind of passed off to them. They can access multiple databases at once. They can use their whatever app they prefer, just with a few plugins, and they're ready to go. Every time they need to do a new session, they can just refresh the data immediately. You can get fresh data, redo a lot of their manipulations, and they're good to go. Real-time data. Or if we're talking about the types of things that go directly into a downstream service, like the ones you see at the transit stations or things like that, quite often we'll have like multiple microservices in the background. And we had a prototype that involved AI that involved some like 15 different microservices translating data and things like that, all into kind of a stream that came out the other end as like a real-time dashboard of like emergent diseases around the world. Or you can do things like, if you have an outside researcher and you want to make sure that privacy is retained in a very sensitive database, such as those like patient records, there are ways in which you can basically give them dummy data with which they can kind of train their models and kind of start working with things and thinking about how they want to manipulate things. Then they can send their runs in to a trusted research environment at TRE. And get the research back. For those of us who have been in the data science game for a long time, this is like a return to the 1990s, where we always had to send our data runs in SPSS format or SAS format across the ocean on email sometimes, only to get back a bunch of error messages. But this is the way to prevent that. And so the next axis, which is the software stack, we just kind of think about how do we create a good separation of concerns so that when we make or update one piece, it's not going to cause everything to break. Now, I understand that some people are dealing in systems where there's a monolith, because like Ruby on Rails or Django or these sorts of things, where it's one big giant kind of monolith. The trend is more towards kind of making these a little bit more modular. And so we're kind of encouraging that. Going forward to make things easier to kind of evolve, especially if the same people who who created the service originally aren't around to kind of maintain it, right? That can be a code base that'll be hard to untangle. And in terms of kind of generating an ecosystem, what we do is we think about this in terms of like the software factory, like how can we have a unified design language that can be reused instead of having to kind of redo color palettes or things like that. Reusable modules and subsystems that we can kind of store in the cloud and make open to everybody. And this is the type of thing that allows us to make sure that our systems are ever fresh. We just kind of take out one module, put in another with minimal amounts of refactoring, right? And that's one of the ways in which we make sure that our services stay up to date and they're constantly evolving. And that's the three main frameworks that I wanted to talk about today. And my time is up. So with that, I don't know if we've got time for questions. Yes, we've got some time for questions. And I'm happy to answer those related to these or anything else related to the guides or the kind of work that we're doing at FAC or what have you. Do we have a microphone? Yep, we've got a microphone at the back, and if there's any questions, you can raise your hand. in the research game, when we're dealing with kind of groups of people, one of my colleagues said this once. It's sort of like, I'm an introvert. I can outwait silence forever. So if anyone's got, okay, we've got a question here.
So I thought this was great. I mean, we do a lot of this work and struggle with some of it. One thing I want to ask you about is, so we develop primarily like dashboards and reporting, and then we expect these to sort of evolve over time. And you spoke about like how to invite in the clients. What we struggle with, especially kind of afterwards, when we have the product out and we want to continue to evolve it, is the client inviting us back in. So it's like we start learning that things have changed in the business, but no one's contacted us to make changes in the applications. So how do you, it's been a tough nut to crack. Like how do you keep that engagement going, would you say?
Yeah, this is like, as someone who's just kind of rejoined the government in the last 2.5 years, I can understand how this can be a real problem, because it's sort of like everything is kind of budgeted, everything kind of, once you get to completion, it can be kind of difficult to then motivate, like how do we do the next cycle of change. And so this is kind of part of the approach that we've taken, is heavily oriented around building capacity. Because it's not enough because whenever we get an assignment like this, it's the clients that come and they say, we just want you to do it. Like, we're just going to hand it off to you, it'll be good. And our approach, as you probably sensed, is sort of like, no, we're dragging you through the whole thing so you can see how it's done, so we can build your capacity so that you're not dependent on us anymore, and that you can start doing these things in subsequent rounds. That's the dream, at least, right? Now, I understand that this is a bit of a challenge. There are capacity problems and these sorts of things. But once we kind of generate, like once people have gone through this process once, and some of the governments that I've worked with around the world, we've done this more than once in other contexts, they start to see the value, and they just start to reproduce some of these kind of methods, because some of the things like the ideation and these sorts of things, they're kind of like helpful tools that you can just kind of reuse and reuse and reuse to start to re-engage clients over and over again. And so we do things like empathy mapping and some of these techniques that are often popular in design circles. And suddenly clients are starting to use them again in subsequent rounds, right? And they might not reinvent the service wholesale each time, because one of the things that we know about design is that design is mostly about redesign. So there's no tabula rasa, there's no blank slate, you have to deal with your legacy systems, and there's another kind of long spiel I could go on about how to kind of cope with that. But you're always going to have, like, part of the answer here is you want to kind of inculcate this kind of approach and build their capacity, and that's kind of how we've been doing it. Yes?
I'm curious what your thoughts were about how the organizational structure and how analytics is structured within an organization itself can influence the data democratization. And just to give an example to flesh this out, like let's say there's an organization where it's very centrally organized. You have like one central organized analytics team that's supporting all the pillars of the business, versus sometimes similar to the banks where it's more distributed, like different business units have their own analytics teams and so on and so forth. So do you feel like that the way, or sometimes it's even like which exec do certain analytics teams report to? Do you feel like that internal organizational structure can influence how much democratization you're able to achieve and the pace and so on?
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind with this question. One is, if you've got, whether it's a centralized group, we force them out of their central silos, because we don't want these chateau generals calling the shots from far from the battlefront. If there's people who are doing data analytics work elsewhere in the organization, we want to bring them together and so that they're mingling. And the same goes for people if they're from disparate kinds of groups. We try to bring those people together in order to kind of share ideas about what kind of common platforms they could use, what kind of common problems they're dealing with. So right off the bat, we're trying to break down silos to get the same people into the room and then force them to think about the other people who might have dependencies on them, right? So that's one thing I think about from the question. The other aspect of this is that this comes with a lot of these guides come with a lot of advice about how to deal with air cover. Because processes like this, they have to deal independently of interfering executives and their second guessing, right? Or people who just want to veto things after you've got this fantastic kind of participatory process, which is very democratized and people have kind of gone through it, and then have some random executive issue a veto or something. So part of that is about managing expectations of the executives to kind of get their sign-in on the original sort of sandbox, as we call it. And then part of it is making sure you're creating air cover and autonomy for a team like this to kind of build the things and be and work very confidently to service kind of real client needs, as opposed to second guessing and thinking about what kind of central politicking might be taking place. Do we have time for another question? No? Okay, I think this is it, and we're wrapping up. Thanks.